Well, ladies and gentlemen, I adore speaking with Michel Bauwens, and I am thrilled that we have episode 4 on peer-to-peer foundations. And we've spoken about Cortani, we've spoken about macro histories, we've spoken about many different topics, and the commons obviously as being central. And the question is, who are the agents of change? Who can change history? What does it mean to change history? Because that's kind of a lurking question behind this. And I think it's a critical question to look at and to think and to go through various thinkers who have taken that question on. And so Mr. Bauwens and I thought we'd get together and talk about it. So Mr. Michel Bauwens, let me pass it to you to get us started. And thank you for being here, sir. It's always a treat.
Right. It's okay. Thank you. Yeah, always a huge pleasure to talk with you. So, I used to be a Marxist when I was young. It's a long time ago, 40 years ago. And so I was steeped in this idea of working class as the agent of change, right? I think historically it makes sense. 19th century, the enclosures, farmers have to go to the cities, they die when they're 35, they're disorganized, so they need, a narrative to bind them together, to give them courage. And I think, Marxism and the socialisms were like a necessary thing in that context. And also because I think at that time, I mean, there was a structural reality in my view that, working class people had a structural position within the capitalist system where, their work was necessary and their withdrawal would, be very bad for the continuation of the system, right? Um, so then, of course, we have to say that eventually, for various reasons, we stopped believing in this. And, I'll just give a few arguments like this. For example, that the working class itself, became social democratic. They were they were successfully represented by reform parties, which improved their lives. And to the degree that they improved their lives, they lost their radicalism and became part of the system themselves, becoming consumers eventually, and over the longer period, even losing their culture. And I think 68 is a good departure point for when you have 10 million workers in the street. The goal has to leave the country, is afraid of revolution, and what they decide then is basically to deindustrialize the West, and to give rock and roll to the kids, you know, and and that breaks the power of the working class. But so I also want to mention probably the capacity, the willingness of workers to fight each other for their nation, right? So where all the left-wing parties vote for the war credits in World War One and World War Two. So very obviously the nation is more important to them than the class. It's just a fact. And then I think the third factor would be, the collapse of the Soviet Union, and that's really the end of the utopian hope that, there is an alternative of that kind. And so then we descend into micro politics and minority politics and all of that, right? So, yes, just briefly to acknowledge that there is a huge working class in the global south, but again, it doesn't give any signs that it's being mobilized and inspired by this ideology. So it really seems like an ideology which still exists in academics, but in the opposite way that Marx wanted, which is, he said we have to stop critiquing society, we have to change it. And now we clearly, if you're Marxist in university, it's all about critiquing society and not about changing, right? So this is where we are. So and then yes, then the other thing, of course, is that the this dualistic or dialectic vision of two forces seems too simplistic to explain how societies evolve. And so this is where I want to bring in very briefly, the ideas of Bertrand de Jouvenel in his book on power. To be honest, I read another book by Bond that is called Nemesis, but it basically explains the Juvenel. And so what I find interesting about the Juvenel and this trialectic vision, where there are three elements that have to be in relation to each other, is that he says, well, there's always a top, a middle, and a bottom. And many times when you think that it's a fight between the bottom and the top, it's very often the top mobilizing the bottom against the center, right? So a typical example he would give is you have a monarch. The monarch wants more power. The aristocracy doesn't want to give him more power. So he seeks allies in the cities amongst the bourgeois to ally against the middle, right? So that's something you wouldn't necessarily see if you have a pure dialectical view, right? So I think that's very rich and regenerative and generative. I mean, when you try to look at situations in three instead of two players, and of course, even more interesting, of course, is when you have splits, right? So Mark Whitaker, who has a really great book called Ecological Revolutions. He's an American scholar based in Seoul, and he's a friend of mine as well. And so he talks about degradative and regenerative jurisdictional coalitions. So that throughout time, there's always the possibility to have coalitions that want to, basically extract the maximum amount of surplus and become degradative for their own milieu, their own environment, right? And then reactions to it, which want to restore, some kind of health, right? And it might sound bizarre, but I think that if we look at today, this is a much more realistic way to look at what's happening, for example, in the US, where I think you have a split in the ruling class. You have an elite and a counter elite. I think the elite is, globalist, as they would say, like they're linked with global financial flows. They don't really care necessarily about their own, territory. And I think I forgot who said it, but I really like the formula. So one side wants to sacrifice the nation to the empire, and the other side wants to sacrifice the empire to the nation. And I think that's a really good formula because you think about the Trump coalition, it's about reindustrialization of the territory, right? So in my view, it's the rural, maybe the what remains of the working class, small business owners, like people who are more dependent on the territory of the US itself and who are threatened by deindustrialization and migration and all of that, right? And the other side is the financial class, but also the cognitive people who, because they have access to computer, they can be nomadic, they can move around, and so they're relatively distanced from territory, right? And so that would be looking at jurisdictional alliances, and I'm very concerned with that because because I was interested in the commons and in promoting the commons, and also looking at how the state could create conditions for the commons, right? So I used to talk about the partner state, and so you could say the neoliberal state competes for capital, right? And there's nothing worse than being exploited by capital than not being exploited by capital, because then you're dirt poor. It's even worse, right? So they will do detax and give subsidies, anything to make capital come to their place. And so the idea with the commons is that a partner state would actually compete to get commoners, right? To get this kind of this local dynamism of citizens creating innovation and so instead of being a welfare state model where you have the state as a producer and the people as a consumer, the vision was that you have a state which enables and empowers individual and collective self-empowerment. So you create the conditions for, right? And I always thought that the ideal vehicle for that would be red-green coalitions.
Mm.
And I have some experience with that. I was invited to Ecuador. I worked for a coalition in Ghent, the city of Ghent in Belgium. Um, and so here's where, it's the idea that in some way there's been a flip-flop between the left and the right,
Mm.
right? So whereas the left used to be the working class party, representing the interest of the working class, gradually became a party representing the educated urbanites, and managing neoliberalism, making it softer. So there's a shift on class where working class people now tend to vote for the populist right parties, right? And the city elites tend to vote for the left parties. On I think we can also see on free speech issues that now 70% of the Democrat voters want more censorship. So it's the progressive parties who are now want to control free speech and are opposing pluralism. So that's another flip, right? And then of course on culture, I can think of many ways in which we flipped, where women's rights are now endangered because of the trans issue, access to sports, and all of that. I think conversion therapy, we used to be against it, and there's massive amounts of physical conversions happening now under progressive banner. So these are already three, I'm sure there's more where we can see a certain a polarity reversal, which I think has to do with class. It's certainly related to the class reversal, to the different social composition of the. And so here's, a thought that so I think class will persist, even though Marxism is maybe not the right tool to analyze it, but certainly class is important. And so if the left is no longer the vehicle for working class desires and power, that means class will express itself in the right populist movements. Where I think there's a tension between market libertarianism and people who want industrial policy and reindustrialization and basically actually a strong state. And I think this tension exists. And I think personally the weakness of Anglo-Saxon populism is that it's too market oriented.
Mm.
And so, you make promises, then you when you get elected, you do a big tax cut for the billionaires and you lose working class votes. Whereas in Europe, because they come from Christian democratic roots, which used to be like these class alliance parties that existed in Europe after World War II, with the social doctrine of the Catholic Church. So they have this kind of inbuilt social doctrine, even as they move to the right, but they have a social doctrine. And so you see like Hungary and Poland retained much longer success rates and actually being reelected 4 times in a row, because they have things like almost like a basic income if you have 3 children, right? And that creates a social bond between the working class and those parties. And anyway, so this is kind of something I wanted to say. And then, so de Jouvenel, let's go back to the main thread. So de Jouvenel 3 instead of 2, right? And so you can look at top, middle, and bottom different potential alliances between factions of the bottom, the middle, and the top. So then you can start thinking like what I just did. Is it maybe possible to have an alliance for the commons where we don't expect it on the other side, right? Because they have a community ideology and all of that. So I'm not saying it's going to be easy, but I'm thinking it's not out of the question. It's like something that might be actually possible. Okay, so another way to look at the complexity of these social dynamics is Earl Thompson. And he makes a very important point, which is the following. We have to make the difference between the ruling elites and the managerial elite, the 1% and the 20%. And he says the ruling class can rule, but it can't manage. Right? And so you need a specific managerial class to do that. And the managerial class, he says, is driven by ideological factions. And so then what the ruling class will do, through its funding and philanthropic capitalism and, all kinds of ways, it can promote one faction above another, right? So, and I would give the example that, World War II happens, millions of workers sacrifice, risk their lives for the country. They come back, they're patriotic, they feel they gave a lot to the country. In some countries they're armed, like in Italy and France, the working class is armed. They came back where they have guns. But then also the Russia is still there, just one half of Europe. So obviously you need Keynesians, right? So you if you're the ruling class at that time, you're going to choose Keynesians, put them in all the positions, and they're in charge of this kind of class contract, this new welfare state contract between the working class representatives and the rulers, and create a managerial class which can manage that, right? Okay, I want to make a little historical I'll just say like a tunnel, let's put it that way, and then I'll come back to what's happening now. So Thompson mentions the case of the Dutch Republic in the 17th century, which was actually some kind of corporate state, with like merchants allied in the United Provinces. And they listened to a faction which said, we need to abolish the guilds. Because, they stop innovation, they're demanding too much, and they did. What happened was, because of this, is that the Dutch working class no longer wanted to fight for their country, right? Because they had lost all these advantages, right? And so why I think this is an important example, which shows that the ruling class can make wrong choices, right? This is very important to remember. So just to finish that part of the story, he then shows that in the UK it went better because they had the gold standard. And the gold standard, he says, allowed to increase the money supply during war, but then to rediscipline after the war, right? And that was like a cybernetic engine to manage these cycles and these crises.
Right.
And therefore, abolishing the guilds became more like an organic process.
Right.
They were gradually weakened through these dynamics, but they didn't have to abolish them. So that's the story that Earl Thompson tells. And so if you apply this today, I think this is what happened in 2013 again, right? So 2008, huge systemic crisis. 50% unemployed young people in Greece, in Portugal, in Spain, 30% in France, big issues in the US as well. The greatest loss of housing wealth in minorities in the US under Obama. So like a huge blow to the middle class in the US, right? And so then in 2011, you get Occupy. And Occupy has a very dangerous message. 1%. The 1% against the 99%. And this is where the story of Vivek Ramaswamy comes in his book Woke Inc., where he says there was a panic because this is the absolute worst narrative for the ruling class. Everybody again allying against you. That is not good, right? And so they saw a demonstration of African Americans against Sanders at some point, and they, like very early woke, and they accused Sanders of being a white supremacist. And that was very interesting for a lot of people. First of all, for the Democrats themselves, who used this dynamic to derail Sanders in Georgia because they'd been winning, all the primaries, right? But also like a massive realization in the people around Vivek that wow, these are the people we need to support. And I can't remember who did that, but you have this ngram analysis. Ngram is a Google search service where you can count your occurrences of words, right? And suddenly it's like a 3,000% growth in the racial language of the woke, right? So that's not an accident. You don't need to be a conspiracy theorist to say that this was like a strategic process, a strategic decision. And so from that moment on, there's a huge shift. And it's like the Mount Pelerin Society. It was just 20 people, right? And it became neoliberal hegemony. And so now there's woke hegemony. So basically, this kind of cultural neoliberalism is now, the language of empire. It's how it's what they promote, how they think. The State Department is funding drag queen shows in Ecuador. If you want to be a friend of the US, you have to vote these laws. So very clearly, that's like a change in managerial elite by choosing one ideological faction over another. So I feel in this case, it's a validation of Thompson's modeling that really works, I think, right? So this is a bit different, but I think it also works quite well. Is the idea of coordination engines creating their own elites, right? So 5,000 years ago, we invent writing and accounting on tablets and then on papyrus and all of that, and that creates a writing elite, right? And what does the writing elite do? It creates the state civilization, the market state system. So I think this is important because it shows how a group of people, when they can control the flow of resources, create a world that works for them. That's kind of the argument, right? In the 14th century, when Lucia Pacioli, a Franciscan monk, invents double entry accounting, he creates the vehicle for capitalism, right? And because of the peculiar situation of the West, where you have free guild cities with merchant guilds, no empire. I mean, there is, the Holy Roman Empire in Germany, but historians say it was neither holy nor Roman nor an empire, right? It was an interesting structure, but it wasn't an empire as the Roman Empire was. It was a decentralized structure,
Yeah.
right? And so because of this peculiar situation in Europe is going to succeed to create eventually this capitalist system, right? So again, there's a merchant elite within the cities that creates a world at their image. gradually, right? By creating all these tools and ideas that eventually create a world. And so here I'm going to make a leap of faith, but I'll let you judge whether that is interesting. So it's a bit how I see Web3,
Mm.
right? So what is Web3? It's a new language, code.
Mm.
It's a peculiar group of people that, because they have their craft with them and they can be nomadic with it, like inherently create a translocal world. So Web3, if you look at them as a emerging coordination elite, I would make the same argument. They're trying to create through Web3 and all these values that are inherent to it, decentralized world. They're creating a new coordination engine, which is of course emerging now, but they're trying basically to do the same thing. And I don't think they can do it alone. And this is where Hansi Freinacht, is writing a new book and published a chapter, the first chapter on the internet, which is interesting because he kind of says a bit of the same thing. He says, and it's also like Karatani, by the way. So let's follow this argument. So you have a new coordination engine, and once it gets going, it's very disruptive. It creates havoc. It completely reorganizes society, and so that creates a reaction. And he calls it the coordination engine and the purification generator or engine. I forgot, right? So this is where religions play a role, right? You have like the Axial Age, right? So all Buddhism, Hinduism, monotheistic religion, they all kind of emerge around the same time. Greek philosophy, the Hebrew prophets, and the best way to see that, I think, is that the disruption of the tribal economy had become so total, and the cruelty of the civilizational regimes became so excessive, like the Assyrians, for example, that it created a revolt in the people that took on a spiritual form, right? And so that's also, I think, a very interesting dynamic where, and kind of explains also the oscillations, right? Where so you have particular way of doing things like a slave society, but it creates so many negatives after a while that you get as a reaction, like for example, Christian religion, which rejects slavery, which honors labor instead of putting it down, which goes back to the land instead of in the city. So it's like a set of reactions against something that is fundamentally wrong, right? So that's, I think, a coordination engine is also interesting. And okay, so now I want to say something about transitions and seed forms. This was my original insight. So my original insight, this is 20 years ago. I took a 2-year sabbatical to read about transitions. So so what I saw was that revolutions, the way Marxists see them as like the primary engine of change, they're rare. And in my view, they don't happen at the beginning, but at the end of the process. So it's like a pressure cooker dynamic. If the society doesn't reform itself, it will lead eventually to revolution. But what you see is that it was the Junkers in Germany who created the nation state. It was the Tsar who abolished serfdom in Russia, right? So there's a lot of different ways for social change to happen that doesn't involve the kind of revolutions we've seen in France and Russia. And so basically, so this is the way I see it. You have an old system which originally had a function. It solved a number of issues, right? It came with a new mode of production, new technologies, and it creates a new social order. It solves a number of things for that social order. And even perhaps to the degree that it does that, it creates new problems that it can't solve, right? So as it starts declining because of this dynamic, you cannot solve the new problems with that paradigm because that's the paradigm that created the problems that it can't solve under its own logic, right? So that's the second step. Then it's going to be an exodus, right? So visionaries first, who have what I call anticipatory consciousness, but followed by all the people who can no longer survive in the core because it is becoming dysfunctional, right? And so that gives you the image, a very important part of recognizing seed forms, right? So, for example, purgatory emerges in the 11th century and allows people to lend money without going to hell. It facilitates banking by Christians and in a way capitalism as well, to create a market economy in the city. The printing press creates a technology that disseminates narratives faster than that the old system can control the narrative, right? Double entry book accounting. So these are seed forms that eventually create subsystems and eventually, cre- create one subsystem which eventually becomes stronger and stronger. At some point, you have an equilibrium, like the absolute state is created when the descending feudal class and the ascending bourgeois class have the same kind of force. And so that gives a lot of power to the arbiter, right? And then eventually the new one becomes dominant. And so you could then say that you have this kind of shift from managerial and producing classes, right? You have slaves and masters, serfs and lords, workers and capital, right? And so what I'm saying basically with my own theory is that we now get commoners and hierarchical capital, right? So the salariat was the main form of industrial capitalist society, is slowly disintegrating, is creating a precarious class, and that precarious class needs the digital commons to organize itself, right? Um, the, does that make the commoners a class? Maybe not, but it is a social condition, right? It's a social condition whereby if you don't have digital commons, you're weak. And if you have digital commons, you can self-organize yourself in networks, right? And so in a way, then I start mixing things, right? Because for example, Web3, I think is also a community of faith, right? So you know about Vergelin, right? So Vergelin, right, he describes how medieval Christianity was still transcendental. So there is no hope in this society. It's about creating a body of light, and so it's not about like making the world a better place to change it. It's to be the best possible person you can and the best possible community you can, in a fallen world. And then Joachim de Fiore, horizontalizes this hope, right? So then suddenly you get hope in the future, and then ideologies come out of that: Marxism, fascism, liberalism, and you could say these are secular forms of faith, right? They use the mental categories that they had, but then they change it and adapt it and secularize it. Um, but they create communities. They're like militant churches, with a messianic, right? And in a way, and I'm becoming closer to them because I live in Chiang Mai, which is like a nomadic capital. There's an enormous amount of digital nomads here, and I really feel that this is the case. Why do they keep working on this, even though sometimes they lose like 2/3 of their capital, right? And they're still continuing. Why? Because they believe in a decentralized world. they have a faith. You know, there's nuances within that faith, but they have a faith, and that gives them strength. And so maybe, you know, whereas ideologies are now like dead, right? Like Marxism and all of that, this is something new, which is like a techno-social complex. And so I want to, you know, then mention a dynamic which I see. So at the end of Roman Empire, you have the Germanic overlords, you know, and taking power in you know, a divided Western Empire. And so the Roman elite can no longer bear arms, but they have to manage the civil administration, which was largely already in the hands of the church. And so what are they doing? They're massively supporting monasteries. Why? Because it's where the children can make a career and they can get retirement. And so I remember reading, it's in one of the books by Foucault, where you know, the names of the bishops are Roman and the names of the lords are Germanic. And then only after 2-3 centuries do they start to merge. But so in the beginning, very clearly, and you know, this is a jurisdictional alliance, just to apply that, right? So you have Clovis, the Frankish king, who is a Germanic warlord who's supposed to divide up with his fellow warriors, but instead he makes an alliance with the Roman Catholic Church against the Arian Church of his own people. Mm. And that jurisdictional alliance creates the basis for Western civilization. You know, that's the new jurisdictional alliance that is going to be like the model for everything for the next few centuries. And so why am I saying this? Because I think this is happening with Web3 as well. So you have, you know, an increasing panic in the elites, and they're putting their money in Web3 because it's also an arbitrage mechanism for nations and territories, right? If something goes bad here, you can go there. And I'm not saying this is the answer, right? But it gives Web3 a temporary amount of huge financing, which in a way also creates a huge R&D environment, a huge experimental environment that is sufficiently funded to try out many, many seed forms. But where I don't see it working is that they're not involved in productive capacity. And so they have eventually, this is what I'm trying to do in this environment, to create an alliance between the urban commoners who are, you know, reorganizing provisioning system, making sure they have food and energy and, you know, the things that the state and the market increasingly do not provide well. And if they could ally themselves, you know, with this coordination engine that is being developed, right? So that's what I call cosmolocalism, which is the connection between relocalized production and translocal coordination. And so I look at history as a history of coordination elites. So you could say that World War I destroyed empires, and the nation state became the dominant form. But then who would run it? Well, the fascists wanted to run it, the communists wanted to run it, and the liberals wanted to run it in different ways, right? So then you get World War II, which is a war against three coordination mechanisms for the industrial nation state. Then this is interesting. I think Russia collapsed essentially because they could not adapt to the cognitive stage. Mm. So if you look at, you know, the stats, they were very good at industrial development. They grew 3 times faster than the West. They sent, you know, a satellite in space. But when they tried to do cybernetic management, they failed because it would undermine their centralized planning, right? And the same thing happened in Chile in 73, where the left-wing version, CyberSyn, you know, was overrun. But then the Chicago boys created this cybernetic neoliberal globalism where they could manage, global supply chains with IT. And that's, in my view, why the coordination engine of the Soviets collapsed, because they
Mm,
couldn't adapt to the next stage. And capitalism succeeded in doing that.
mm.
And then my thesis would be that we might well be at the end of the market state coordination. And so we need something new, which is this cosmo-local peer-to-peer commons-oriented coordination.
Mm.
Um, anyway, so I think I probably, did my little story here.
Incredible.
Um, combining different models and tools to try to make sense of the current world and the current transition.
It's incredible. I enjoyed that immensely. Absolutely, absolutely fantastic. Well, a few things come to mind. First off, just as a quick note, I really like the idea of coordination of leads. I think that's correct. I don't think we always connect power and coordination enough. Like there's something that's deeply connected between those. Like power belongs to those of whom can coordinate, right? And that can look like
Right.
money, that can look like law, that can look like information. Coordination takes many forms, right? And to really connect power and coordination, I think, is very important. And then also, that helps bring out the distinction, and for me, the way I language it, between force and power, because force is where I like hold a gun at your head and say you must, and the coordination is very physical, very direct. Whereas power is a coordination that's much more abstract, much more meta, much more environmental, right? And power, there's a way in which when power has to use force, it's failed, right? That's like failure,
Yeah.
right? It wants to stay in the realm of a coordination that is not direct coordination. Because the issue is if I directly coordinate you, it's easy for you to know I'm your enemy because I'm holding a gun at you, right? Like it's easy to revolt against someone who uses force. But if I can use power, it is difficult to figure out what you should revolt against. It becomes much more vague
Right.
and much more unclear. So by locating it, it is in the interest of power to coordinate without force, using the way I'm languaging it, then we can start to identify what the elites do. The elites are primarily in the business of a power coordination, and a force coordination is a failure. They want to stay in the coordination.
Right.
Mr.
And
Bauwens.
is it not what we are seeing today,
Yes, exactly.
where, the effort for global surveillance and, algorithmic control of free speech,
Yes,
um, is because they lost control and they
yes,
want to regain the control by overdoing it, and that is now so obvious and visible
yes,
that it creates an enemy, and that's why the populists are growing,
yes.
because I'm susceptible,
Sure.
I'm also sensitive to that. Like I can see what they're doing and I don't believe them anymore.
Yeah,
Like
yeah,
I don't believe in CNN and MSNBC.
right.
I don't believe them. I checked a few times, and whenever I checked, it wasn't true.
I
You know,
know.
I did actually 4 times. I said, "Wow, that doesn't make the other side right every time, but it does tell you something."
No, I tell Michelle every now and then I force myself to turn on like MSNB and CNN. It's like 1, 2, up 5 seconds, and that's not true. Well, they made it to 5 this time. It's usually only 3, right? So it's like that same feeling of this is ridiculous. But no, but this is where the question of what changes history, what is the agent of history, is really, really important. Because if increasingly it is obvious there is some sort of manipulation occurring, but you respond to that in the wrong way, well, then you actually may make it stronger. Because if popularism looks like, if it looks xenophobic or backwards, then it is easy to break up that resistance, right? And that's kind of the Koratani capital nation state, right?
Right.
So it's really important to rightly locate the proper response to this increasingly visual power
This
structure.
this is what Toynbee says. He says that every slave revolt in Rome failed. So any direct assault of the class system failed.
Yes.
But what succeeded was this constant interstitial creating of new lifestyle by the Christians,
Exactly.
right? Just living differently with different values and having quite a bit of courage to defend that difference eventually, became. He also makes another point, which I think is very interesting. So in Israel, you had the Herodians, and the Zealots. right? The Zealots were the revolutionaries, wanted to overthrow the Romans, and the Herodians wanted to compromise with the Romans. But neither of them won. It was St. Paul who made a new mixture, right? And so when you look at transitions, there are also always bifurcations. So it's a new force, a new synthesis with a mixture of things that becomes the new reality, right?
Absolutely.
The Catholics and the Reformation churches didn't win their civil war. They were marginalized and replaced by capital state nation.
Well, but this, I think that's brilliant. And that to me brings in one of the reasons I really like, as I recall it, Bernard de Jouvenel, and if I say that wrong, forgive me, his book on power, because what's so critical,
Yeah.
that's right. The way he frames it, I think it goes into everything you were saying about these different social movements, wokeism, that seems like an increase of freedom, but actually there's something perhaps problematic going on. The way, as he talks about, he asks that kind of provocative question of, why is it as the state becomes more powerful than ever before, do people actually think they're more free, right? Like, what's going on? That doesn't really make any sense. Like, objectively, if you look at the state, the governments, they're more powerful than ever. And yet lots of people think they're freer.
Right.
So there's a weird thing going on in the point, and it goes to that triplex that you described, the upper, the middle, and the lower. So what he says is what the state does is it weakens the power of church, family, physical constraint, and you thus feel like you're getting more free. But as you have that experience of feeling like you're getting more free, you're not noticing that the state is getting more powerful. So it's a trick. And then if we bring it to Thompson or
and you get atomized and dependent on the center,
exactly.
Right?
That's exactly right.
Atomized and dependent on the center, right?
That's exactly right.
And so yeah, that's the welfare model basically, right?
And to me,
and so this is why we so yeah, I was going to say that why in a session of Western people are so badly off right now because like migrant families coming to Europe, they have their solidarity mechanism. They migrate with them, right? And even Black people in the US over time have learned to create solidarity mechanism. But the white working class have nothing because they gave everything up. And now that they're being marginalized, they don't have anything. And this is the drama of the West, is that we are super atomized. And in a way, and I know it works only for a minority right now, but I think it's powerful. I think this peer-to-peer thing, this Web3, open source, it's like a creation of a new type of community. It's like a relational healing, peer-to-peer basis. And remember did I talk with you about this isonomia? Did we discuss this before?
Yep.
We did, right?
Yes.
So I wrote this article where I claim that what makes open source and Web3 so attractive is not because it's democratic, but it's isonomic. It's no rule. It gives an enormous amount of real personal freedom. Now, this being said, they still don't have many solidarity mechanisms, right? So if they cannot do that, they will remain too weak. But I do think that's that isonomic part is really important.
Well, I think so as well. And what it brings out is what Bernard in his book on power, Gervelli, is bringing out, is that what people talk about as the meaning crisis or nihilism, that is exactly the strategy of the state in order to, in fact, convince you've increased freedom. It worked, though, until the nihilism became vivid. It became unignorable, just like the surveillance. Like, it worked to get the state to a very powerful place, but now everyone's like, oh, we don't have any solidarity. But the problem is, in the process of getting to the place where you realize you didn't have any meaning, the state has grown so powerful along the way that now it feels like, what do we do? Right? And so, because there's a kind of hopelessness, but it's all becoming increasingly vivid, right? The surveillance state is vivid. The loss of meaning, that is precisely the mechanism of increasing your freedom, which makes you distracted from the loss of freedom of the state. It's all coming to a place of vividness. And to me, I'll just note quick, like the transhumanist movement is actually a continuation of this trick where we're going to increase. Oh no, you'll have more freedom. You'll be free from the analog. You'll be free from physics. You'll have more health. You'll live for a longer time. Oh, you'll be free from the church. You'll be free from community. This is a continual kind of distraction, if you will, from not noticing that you're losing freedom in terms of the state because you think you're gaining it through technology. You think you're gaining it through, well, this particular use of the technology. But this is where the agent of change question is really important to hysterically note that really the change that you want has something to do with restoring the triplex of the upper, the middle, and the bottom. Not removing the middle, that's when you get all of these pathologies. The agent of change is in efforts to restore the middle. And that also goes to like Earl Thompson, because there's this weird question that he brings out on like, why is it that profits can go up and wages fall, right? Like there's that weird problem, like corporations can get more money because there's no competition for labor. Well, what's a result of that, right? Well, you don't have a middle. There's no distinctions for the competition, right? So what ends up happening is, in the same way as Bernard says, you cannot notice you're losing freedom because you're being freed from the, you will miss that the state is growing stronger because you think you're gaining freedom as you're being freed from the church. Likewise, if you see your Roth IRA or the stock market going up in profits, that convinces you that the economy is better. And then if you look at your wages and they seem to stagnate, it's like, well, that must not be there, right? And that worked for a really long time until now. It's so obvious that wages have stagnated that it's no longer working. All of these mechanisms of smoke bombing, if you will, to distract us from the growing capital nation state are now so vivid that they can't be ignored and leading to these popularist uprisings. It's just like, not to go out, like, it's like they continually tell you inflation is great in America, don't worry about it. Meanwhile, you still go to Food Line and like, I know they're gaslighting me, dang it, I know they're freaking gaslighting me, but no, it's better now, right? So and as people increasingly go, I'm being tricked, they're gonna uprise. You have this popularist movement, and that's a very potentially positive energy if it is directed toward restoring the middle, the commons, the place that creates the distinction. But if it goes in the direction of transhumanism or fighting against the state, that's going to benefit the capital nation state, because all of that is going to be a false freedom, or it's simply going to be a failed revolution that makes the state look like it was always right. Because look, these people did these things and it failed, right? So it's so important, like you're doing, to get that historical analysis of what actually is the problem, because otherwise that energy can be directed in the wrong way, right? But I think, I think one of the reasons, though, because you mentioned Marx, one of the reasons we're falling into this mistake is because when you talk about three, if you will, like a triplex or trilactics, you're talking about something that, to use that popular reference, is more like a three-body problem. The relationship between those three becomes more complicated and difficult to navigate, right? And life becomes more difficult to understand. But if you can break it down to a dialectic between, say, the working class and the bourgeoisie, well, then it seems much more predictable. There's much more of a certain determinism, right? And here's the issue. There's always in history been a weird and questionable relationship between knowledge and freedom, right? Like, if you don't have knowledge, can you be free? But wait a minute, if you have knowledge, then you're not free because you know what to do, right? So there's always this kind of weird tension, right? There is a feeling as you move from the trilactic to the dialectic that you're becoming more free because you're getting more understanding, right? Because now we know, oh, okay, so there's an alienation in the working class. That's going to lead to a revolution. They're going to turn, they're going to revolt, and that's going to lead to, a global communist order, right? So you feel like you understand, and then here's the other trick. It feels like meaning. Oh, I am part of a movement of history, right? So there's always a temptation to move from the triadic to the dialectic to give you a sense of, actually, this is my point. That move in logic is simultaneously similar to the smoke bomb of thinking you're gaining freedom as you erode the middle, when actually you're losing it, but you're not going to realize it till the dialectic fails, right? Because what is Karatani famous? And it's correct. Marx creates a dialectic by calling everything that would make it more trilectic superstructure, not part of the base. It will dissolve, right? Well, that's convenient. Unfortunately, the state is not superstructure. And it turns out churches, too, are actually sources of people's like church is part of class. Like that's why, as I mentioned to you, I've been revisiting. I read it a long time ago, and like most of the books I read a long time ago, I realized I didn't actually read them. There was a lot more there than I thought. Rereading is a great way to figure out you don't know how to read. You're like, wow, I didn't get. But there's that wonderful book on the making of the working class in modern Britain by E.P. Thompson.
E.P. Thompson, that's E.P. Thompson. Yeah.
And what's so interesting about him is he's like, class is not a clear thing. Class is not just economics, it's culture, it's church. He really says, let class tell you what it is. Don't tell class what it is, right? It's much more organic. It's how people talk with one another and how people identify. Yeah. Well, the problem is when you move into a dialectical frame, you tend to make rigid categorization that isn't actually rigid to fit in the dialectic, right? So basically what you do in the Marxist analysis is you make class economic and everything else superstructure that will be dissolved, right, when actually for the people in class, it's a much more complicated negotiation between many variables, right? But when you boil it down, that feels like you're going to make a coalition. That feels like you can bring people together to do that. And it has a kind of short-term sugar rush of creating activity. But when it ultimately fails, because actually, right, reality is more triadiatic, well, then when that emerges, or you get unintentional consequences, such as increase in profit doesn't lead to increase in wages, increase of freedom from community leads to meaningless, whoops, turns out there was a lot of unintended consequences that occurred. Well, then you're angry, but then that anger, here's the problem. The anger tends to be directed toward what seems most vividly the problem. So let's take out the state. Let's take out the surveillance things, right? Your mind doesn't naturally go to rebuilding the commons to restore the trilectic, because your entire life has been framed as more dialectical, us versus them, all of these kind of different things, right? Like the structure that Marx is putting forth. And again, that creates a feeling of freedom because you feel like you know what's going on. But actually that freedom is illusionary. That keeps you distracted from the loss of freedom that, like Bernard is saying, in different things, right? So it's really important to restore the middle. But the problem is, as you restore the middle, and I should also note, because for Hegel, the dialectic is the essential tension that phenomenon have in being what they are, but also becoming something else. But the dialectic is not so much between A and B, between classes, but the tension that a thing feels that actually moves it into triadics. Hegel's science of logic is full to the brim with triadics, right? Whereas Marx takes the dialectic of alienation and puts it in a dialectic of class, when really for Hegel it should be dialectical tension leads to triadic situations that then we have to judge according to appearance, looking at the science of logic. Well, that's a very different structure. That then leads, of course, to, complexity and chaos theory and all these, the three-body problem obviously leads to chaos theory and different things, right? But that's really important because the issue is, the reason why I think this is, and then I'll give it back to you, the reason why this is so important to identify is because as you build back the middle, per se, your ability to know what will happen will go down because you're increasing complexity, which could feel like the wrong thing to do. This is why this relationship is so important, because a dialectic feels much more, we know what's going to happen, right? It's much more predictable. But if actually history shows is what you need is to restore the middle, the experience of doing that could feel like you're losing freedom because you're gaining a complexity that's unpredictable. And if you associate knowing what's going to happen with being free, your experience will tell you you should stop this, and then you're going to fall back into not having that middle. Thus, you're going to have all these ineffective revolutions. But let me throw it back at you.
I was just thinking about, maybe the idea of seed forms, right? So that when everything goes into chaos, it's important to already have forms that are attractors for the new order, right? So in this situation of, like political chaos where, I don't think there's any really good choice, right? I mean, I tend to critique the left now because I really think there's like its historical arc is over. This is what I think. Like the 68 arc is done. Like this kind of boomer thinking, it's they're I know, I'm a late boomer myself, but it's like it's exhausted and it has turned into its opposite, in this kind of woke uh, insanity. Um, and so, we have these two polarities, and none of them have the solution because, like, if you go to the right populists, they will deny, the ecological issues and that there's many problems with them as well, right? And so I think it's important to build these ordered alternatives on the ground, right? That are relatively independent of the polarity play in the mass society. And so, for example, what I'm thinking of is, if you're Roman in a city and your city is declining, so you need to go back to the countryside, right? And so, what better place than around the monastery, which is already functioning, where people have food, where things are organized, there's no crime. That's where you go because they're already there, right? So that's kind of what I think that needs to be done as well. And I don't know if you know Mark Stallman, East West Digital.
Mm.
Have you seen that? So, so the idea of Michael Hudson that you have the state-centric East Eurasian mass and the market-centric West European. So that's like the big, polarity at geopolitical level. And then you have a new one which is emerging, which is translocal, and that's the digital one, right? But a digital one that is connected to a new physical, right? So it's cosmolocal, translocal. If it just floats there, that's not going to work. But it has to be connected. It has to be a new way to organize the physical. And so things that interest me a lot is now, like the bioregional revival, where people are locally organizing. Where's the food coming from? Where's the energy coming from? How can we protect the local flows, regenerate the rivers, the forests? But in order to do that well, you need to be organized, with knowledge flows that are not just local. You need to, you need the knowledge to flow to your place, right? And that combination, I think, is going to be the winning combination.
No, I think that's
And to be
brilliant.
honest, I'm not clear about the role of the nation in the future. I tend to think in terms of like meta-integrative institutions where, like a DAO, for example, distributed autonomous organization, can integrate markets, can integrate public authorities and regulations, can integrate voluntary organization, and can integrate permissionless contributions in one container, right? So that's kind of, I tend to think that we need, I call it fourth sector organizations.
Mm.
And then the idea of a magisteria of the commons is that somehow these translocal institutions can accrue enough social power to counter, the trans financial networks that are now dominating the territorial nation states, right? So we need to build up that counterpower. And I'm not saying we're ready yet, but I think this is where we need to go.
No, I think that's brilliant. Well, if I keep using the language of middle, just kind of based on the Bernard structure we said from the beginning, basically, you have to have a strong middle, commons, that part of the picture,
Yeah.
in order to offer people alternative ways of valuing and thinking of freedom, precisely to then be incentivized by something other than capital, right? Like if the only freedom you've got or think about is removing the middle, well, then you're free to the degree that you leave the middle, thus go off to a job to make money or live somewhere near a good job. So you can't even think an alternative to the freedom that capital gives you if you don't have the middle, right. Which then, of course,
and the local cannot survive without a middle.
Exactly.
If we're just local and you don't have mediating organizations that build society, you're going to be crushed.
Well, and to me, a way I think about it, like when we talk, again, just to use that Koratani model of the capital nation state, as the middle is dissolved, like Bernard says, the nation, which you could almost, the nation becomes just a pure, uncontained zeitgeist, right? Of how people, like pure ideology, right? Like you really, in a sense, if you grant me this language, a more healthy society that's going to be able to, dare I say, create more value competition, et cetera, so forth, like from the book, your book is going to be one of a capital state commons, really, where the nation is sublated into the commons. Without that, but here's the problem, the state increases its power precisely by devolving the commons to a nation, per se, in that Courtani structure, which then makes it a anger or just kind of an uncoordinated activity that ultimately, if it begins to feel screwed because it sees the surveillance state, rebels against the state and loses, right? So then the capital nation state is wants to make the nation a nation, quote unquote, a zeitgeist versus the commons, please.
So we have an interstate system and we have a transnational finance system, right? But what we don't have is a translocal common system. And if you remember Polanyi, right, the lib-lab dynamic is because the society can restore the balance between market and state on a regular basis. But if transnational finance is strong in the nation state, then it doesn't matter what you do in the nation state.
Yeah.
Because you can't do it.
Exactly.
Right. And so in a way we have to go more local and more cosmic at the same time. That's basically what I think. And then the nation, I think, will remain as a bioregional coordination system.
Yeah.
Because you still need to live in a geographic space with people that may not think and be like you, and you need to organize space. But at a higher level, there's going to be this kind of digital commons that will be, I think, and then AI can serve, for the complexity of these flows of matter and energy at a global scale. But I think we already talked for 2 hours.
Well, I've enjoyed this immensely. Well, there's a few things. So what you're saying about I completely agree. A way I think about it, because I just go back to like David Hume, the Scottish Enlightenment, and the common life. The commons is precisely inseparable from the common experience, the land, the territory, the people. Whereas as you move toward a nation, David Hume would associate that with the philosophical consciousness. You're now thinking about America versus Rustberg, for example, right? The commons, right. And also, funny enough, if Flannery O'Connor is correct, that the more you can actually look at a rock and experience a rock, the more it actually becomes cosmic. The problem, like the more particular and common things are, that actually is the cosmic logic, right? Is found in that particular iteration. Then the commons, you see, the problem in a way is that the nation, as it seems to become grander than the commons, actually becomes less, because it actually loses a concrete experience in which the spirit can be found, right, for Flannery O'Connor. Furthermore, commons always sets a limit to power. Like this was David Hume's kind of point. He basically argues that total war was not possible until philosophical consciousness. Because if somebody came in and said, "Hey, go to war with me," and you go, "Why?" They'd have to say, "Because we're going to increase your food access, your water access." But now they can come in and say, "Because of freedom, because of capitalism." And that's unbound by immediacy. So you can get totalization, which then leads you into total contracts that actually ultimately benefits the state, right? Because if this is the thing for me that's interesting, is that if you add commons to the capital nation state and make the nation more of a commons, it actually, for people, goes higher than the other two, right? It becomes the magistrate. And then, of course, if E.P. Thompson is correct about class, that is actually more so what class tends to, in people's lived experience, be representative of their participation in language that is reflective of their common life. And so maintaining that becomes really important. And I guess also what I would say is freedom is coordination. Like if people don't have coordination, then they're not free. So the question becomes, and this is why I think the Web 3.0, and then I'll bring it to a close and give it for final words. I've really enjoyed this. It's really wonderful. Is that freedom requires coordination, and Web 3.0 has to be about precisely increasing human beings' capacity to coordinate by their own values that reflect their own commons and commons life, not values that are actually given to them, say, by the state or by capital, precisely that ultimately dissolves the middle and actually thus makes you think you're gaining freedom as actually you're losing it because you don't. That's another reason why value competition is so important, or the ability to think according to different values and spirits, as Koratani would say, because otherwise you're vulnerable to this smoke bomb effect that Bernard is talking about. You're actually susceptible to that because you're not able to see these things that are happening around you. And I think too, like on this idea of coordination and like with the commons, and I think also, I guess I was just going to say, another threat though, is that there's an increasingly nomadic group, right, who can go across nations. It's very important that that nomadic freedom is used to create a commons, not to dissolve the middle. That's a risk going on right now, because it feels like you're free. Oh, I can go anywhere, I can live anywhere. Well, that could be another freedom that dissolves the middle if you're not careful. You have to use the nomadic for the sake of a commons and creating networks of coordination that otherwise were not possible. And I think, and then of course, like is also being pointed to, there's some question of a kind of elevation of consciousness or values or spirits to be able to think all of this. This is where things like the liminal web, I mean, and this ability to coordinate language or discussions like this seems very, very important. Because as we were talking before, I'll just throw this in. If indeed William Ong and Marshall McLuhan suggest that changes in information technology change consciousness, but then if even you get a little more wild and start talking about Steiner and Barfield, where modes of consciousness are seen, you can see the kind of fossil record of their transformation and how words are used from, say, poetry or prose. And then I should also add, if Dietrich McCloskey is correct, that changes in rhetoric transform economic activity, and if Jonathan Rauch is correct, that free speech is precisely where knowledge comes from, there's $1 million question of what comes first. Does language change consciousness, or is it information technology that changes language? I think it's the triplex. It's actually an unpredictable relationship between all three, in which our freedom is found, because what like someone at Steiner is saying is that freedom is the capacity to have different modes of consciousness, to have different values, to be not locked into a spirit. But if that work is all in the middle, in the commons, then the only way for people to be free is to have that commons in which they can actually speak with one another, explore different ways of interaction, different exchanges by which they can have new freedoms. Mr. Bauwens.
Yeah, this is why, and I know it sounds naive because, we live in this time where everybody's saying, it has to be concrete. We need action. Everything has to be utilitarian in a way, right? And seriously, I think what we are doing here is just as important.
Yes.
Like to be able to think freely, creatively, because we have our conversation, but then I'm going to think about it.
Yeah.
And it may very well change my life, right?
Yes.
So the ideas are really important. And
Yes.
I think, there is an enormous amount of narrative warfare going on, where they change the language to narrow our possibilities. And I think this is what's happening in the Western world. Science is being regulated. We can't research this. You can't say this. You can't say that. And it's our thinking of many people is regressing. And so it's important to have pockets where we don't go along with that. We keep our free spirit.
Yes.
Yes.
Oh, you've stayed up so late. No,
yeah.
I mean, basically the loss of the freedom of speech almost always seems to dissolve the middle. Like the commons is what is destroyed most, which of course, and then if, friggin' Jonathan Rauch is correct, where all knowledge requires this freedom of speech, this working through things, then basically we can't think. And actually, I'm very concerned that the emphasis on action and utilitarianism leads to a dialectic conception of the world versus a trilectic conception, which then looks like then that's just the growth of the professional managerial class, if you will. And that's then actually, in a way, the managerial class is trying to make us convinced that there's a middle when there's not. It's like, look, there is a comment. You can have influence. No, if you can't have the ability To think and explore new ideas and new values, there is no middle. There's simply a smoke bomb to make you think that there's a realm for your freedom, but really you're losing freedom all while you think you gain it. But Michel Bauwens, I always appreciate speaking with you, sir. Thank you so much.
Yeah, me too. Me too. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much. We'll do it
Bye-bye,
again.
Daniel.